Have you ever felt eyes on you in an empty room? Or heard your name whispered when no one was around? Tonight, we uncover the chilling tales of students who stepped into places they thought were safe, only to realize they weren't alone. These stories will take you deep into the shadows of college campuses, where whispers become screams, and the line between reality and nightmares blurs. But beware, some doors are better left closed. Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear will haunt you long after the video ends. Story 1. The Whispering Walls. Imagine moving into a dorm where the walls whisper your name at night, begging for justice. You tell yourself it's nothing, just the wind or maybe your imagination playing tricks on you. But what if it's something else? Something that's been waiting for years, something that's never let go. Maya didn't know she was walking into a nightmare. Maya had always dreamed of college life. She worked hard in high school, stayed focused, and earned a scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. She was a black freshman, excited but nervous about stepping into a new chapter of her life. It was a chance to prove herself, to show the world what she was capable of. But her dream quickly started to unravel. The moment she set foot in the old dormitory, she felt it. There was something strange about the place, something unexplainable. The building was ancient. Flickering lights, creaky floors, and an unsettling cold that never seemed to leave, no matter how high she cranked the heat. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. Maya had heard the rumors. Everyone on campus had heard them. The dorm was haunted, they said. Whispers floated in the halls about strange occurrences. Flickering lights, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing by themselves. But Maya shrugged them off. Ghosts? She didn't believe in that stuff. She wasn't going to let a few silly rumors ruin her excitement. But that first night, that was when things started to change. She had spent the entire day unpacking, organizing her new life. She was determined to make the most of her time at the university. Her roommate, Clara, was already out at some campus event, leaving Maya alone in their room. The silence of the dorm was unnerving, but she tried to ignore it, settling into her bed to study. But then she heard it, a faint whisper. Maya froze. It wasn't Clara. She could hear Clara's voice clearly from down the hall. This was different. The whisper was soft, almost like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. It was barely audible, but it was there. Maya, help me. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up in bed, straining her ears to listen. Nothing, only the creaking of the old building. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind. Maybe some old pipes groaning. She pulled the covers over her head and tried to forget about it. She told herself she was just tired from the move-in day, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But when she closed her eyes, the whisper came again, louder this time. Maya, help me, please. She shot up from her bed and glanced around the room, her pulse racing. Clara wasn't back yet, and the room was eerily still. There was no one else in the room, no one who could have whispered her name like that. She grabbed her phone and texted Clara, asking if she was messing with her. No response. Maya let out a deep breath and slowly rose from the bed, her feet padding softly on the old wooden floor. She moved toward the door, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the voice. But there was nothing. She felt a chill in the air as she opened the door. The hallway was dimly lit, and the building was strangely silent. Maya frowned, walking out into the corridor. The old place had an eerie feel, with the walls peeling in places and the floorboards creaking under her feet. But she shrugged it off, telling herself it was just an old building. The whispers stopped as she stepped into the hallway, but that didn't bring her any comfort. In fact, it only made her feel more unsettled. She walked down the hall, glancing at the rooms as she passed them. Every door was closed and the dim lights flickered overhead. But it wasn't until she passed by the first room, room 113, that she felt it, a strange pull. Maya stopped in her tracks. She didn't know why, but something about that room felt off. It was the only door on the floor that was cracked open. She could see only a sliver of darkness beyond it. And as she stared at the door, she felt like it was calling her. Her breath caught in her throat, and without fully understanding why, she took a step forward. She had to see what was inside. Her hand reached out, and she pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. It was pitch black in the room, the only light coming from the flickering bulb in the hallway. Her pulse quickened as she stepped into the darkness, her senses on high alert. She couldn't explain why, but something told her to leave. Something told her to turn around and never look back. But she didn't. She took another step, her shoes making soft tapping sounds on the cold floor. And then, as if on cue, the whispers returned. "Maya, help me." It was louder now, clearer. But it didn't come from the walls this time. It came from the far corner of the room. Maya's heart raced as she slowly turned her head. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it, a figure. A figure huddled in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. "Maya," the voice whispered again, but it wasn't the voice of a woman. It was something else, something darker. Her feet froze to the floor. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. The figure in the corner shifted, and Maya's blood ran cold as she saw its eyes, empty, hollow, lifeless eyes staring straight at her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't listen. And then, suddenly, the room went cold. The whispers stopped. Maya didn't know how long she stood there, frozen in fear, but eventually, her body regained control. She bolted from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran back to her dorm room and slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. She leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. The room was silent, but Maya knew that it wasn't over. The whispers would be back, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Maya spent the next few days trying to convince herself that the events in room 113 were just a fluke. She had been tired from the long drive to campus, the excitement of moving in, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility that came with the beginning of her college life. Her mind was probably just playing tricks on her, she told herself. But even as she tried to focus on her studies, something about the dorm kept nagging at her, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. Every night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She had trouble falling asleep. She would close her eyes, but as soon as she was just about to drift off, she would hear it again, the whisper. Maya, her eyes snapped open. Her roommate, Clara, was fast asleep in the bed across from her, snoring softly. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside the window. Maya's breath caught in her throat. There it was again, but this time it was louder, clearer, almost like it was right beside her. Maya, her heart raced. She sat up quickly, her eyes scanning the dark room. The walls felt suffocating, the air thick with an unseen presence. She turned to look at Clara, still fast asleep, unaware of the strange occurrences that were happening just a few inches away. Maya's hands were shaking. There was no way Clara could have whispered her name, but the sound was unmistakable. It felt like it was coming from inside her head, or perhaps from the very walls themselves. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. "You're just tired. It's just the dorm creaking." But even as she said the words, a feeling of dread settled deep in her stomach. Maya lay back down, staring at the ceiling, hoping that sleep would come, but her mind wouldn't let go of the whispers. Were they real? Was she losing her grip on reality? The next morning, Maya shook off the events of the night, convinced that she had imagined it all. She had an early class to attend, and she needed to focus. But when she walked out of the dorm and bumped into one of her classmates, Sarah, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Sarah was a senior, friendly and chatty. Maya had spoken to her a few times in passing, and Sarah always seemed to know something about everyone on campus. "You know," Sarah said, eyeing Maya with a knowing look, "I don't mean to scare you, But that dorm you're staying in, it's got a dark history." Maya frowned, unsure of where Sarah was going with this. "What do you mean?" "Well," Sarah hesitated, glancing around like she didn't want anyone overhearing. "I'm sure you've heard the rumors, right? About the ghost? The one that haunts your dorm." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't want to admit it, but she couldn't help the feeling that Sarah was talking about the very same whispers she'd heard. "I've heard a few things," Maya said cautiously, trying to downplay her anxiety. "What's the story?" Sarah lowered her voice to a near whisper. "Well, they say there was a girl, an African-American student just like you, who lived there years ago. She was harassed by some of the white students. They'd leave nasty notes, call her names, and make her life a living hell. Eventually, it drove her to a breaking point. No one knew exactly what happened, but one night, she disappeared. Some people say she jumped out of the window, but others say she was pushed." Maya's stomach twisted at the thought. "The thing is," Sarah continued, her voice dropping lower, "they say her spirit still roams the halls. And at night, she whispers to the students. It's like she's trying to warn them, or maybe just looking for revenge." Maya felt her throat go dry. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Could this be the same voice she had heard? Could the whispers be coming from this girl's spirit, trapped in the walls of the dorm, yearning for something, perhaps justice? "I wouldn't stay there too long if I were you," Sarah added, giving Maya a serious look. "The dorm is cursed. People have felt it, heard it, and some of them don't make it out." Maya felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. She laughed nervously. "Thanks for the warning, Sarah. I'll keep that in mind." But inside, she was shaken. Was this why she was hearing the whispers? Was this the reason the dorm felt so wrong? That night, Maya lay in bed once again, the darkness surrounding her like a suffocating blanket. Her mind raced, unable to quiet her thoughts. She kept replaying Sarah's words in her head, over and over. Suddenly, the whispers returned. "Maya," but this time the voice sounded different. Angrier, desperate. "Maya, help me." Maya's heart slammed in her chest. She shot up, her hands trembling as she glanced around the room. Clara was still asleep, unaware of the turmoil raging inside Maya. The whispers continued, growing louder. Maya couldn't take it anymore. She had to find out what was going on. She jumped out of bed and grabbed her flashlight, determined to search the dorm for answers. She couldn't let this go any longer. She had to find the truth. Maya's search led her straight to the dorm's basement, a place she had never ventured before. The air was thick with mildew, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the silence. She didn't know why she was drawn to the basement, but she couldn't ignore the pull. Something was down there. The further she went, the darker it became. She walked cautiously, the light from her flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. She didn't know what she expected to find, maybe old storage boxes, forgotten furniture, or just the remnants of an old building. But what she found was far worse than she could have imagined. In the farthest corner of the basement, covered in dust, was a small wooden chest. It looked ancient, the wood worn and cracked with age. Maya's hands shook as she knelt down beside it. She knew deep down that this was it, the answer to the whispers that had haunted her. She opened the chest carefully, the hinges creaking as she lifted the lid. Inside was an old leather-bound diary, yellowed with age. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The first page was blank, but the next few were filled with careful handwriting. Maya began to read, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart pounding. The diary belonged to a student named Eleanor Hayes. She had been a freshman in the same dorm, just like Maya. The entry started out innocently enough, talking about classes, meeting new friends, and adjusting to life at college. But as the pages went on, the tone began to change. Eleanor wrote about the constant harassment she endured from her classmates. Nasty comments, cruel pranks, and constant isolation. Maya could feel the pain in Eleanor's words, her isolation seeping through the ink. The entries became more and more desperate. "They call me names," one entry read. "The whispers are getting louder. I hear them even when no one is around. It's like they're in the walls, and they want me to leave. I don't know how much longer I can take this." Maya's stomach churned as she read the next few entries. The harassment intensified, and Eleanor began to fear for her safety. The whispers became more frequent, and she started to believe that the dorm was haunted by something evil. She begged for help, but no one would listen. Then, the last entry hit Maya like a punch to the gut. "I can't take it anymore. The whispers are too much. They want me gone. I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep fighting. Maybe it's better if I just disappear. At least then they'll leave me alone." The final words were barely legible. Maya felt tears prick at her eyes. Eleanor had been driven to the brink of madness by the torment she had faced. And now, it seemed like her spirit had been trapped in the dorm, forced to relive the horror over and over again. Maya closed the diary, her hands shaking. She felt a deep sense of guilt for not knowing, for not hearing Eleanor's cries sooner. But now, she understood. The whispers weren't just the sound of a restless spirit. They were the cries for help. Eleanor's torment had never ended, and now it was reaching out to Maya. Maya knew what she had to do. She had to help Eleanor. But would she be able to stop the curse of the dorm before it consumed her too? Maya's hands were shaking as she held the diary. The words were still fresh in her mind, echoing in her ears. Eleanor's story was more than just a history of pain. It was a warning. But as she sat there in the dim basement, clutching the diary to her chest, a chilling realization began to set in. She wasn't alone. The temperature in the room dropped abruptly. A sharp, icy gust of wind whipped through the basement, causing Maya's breath to fog in the air. Her heart skipped a beat. The whispers, once faint and distant, now felt like they were right beside her. "Maya, help me." The voice was louder now, a growling rasp that made her blood run cold. She felt a presence moving behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, her flashlight flickering as it swept across the room. The light danced over the walls, the shadows creeping along like dark tendrils. Then, out of nowhere, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Maya yelped in shock, scrambling to her feet. She tried to yank the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in. The temperature dropped further. The air so cold now it felt like the life was being sucked out of her. She was trapped. "Maya, this time." The whisper was right behind her. Her spine went rigid. She slowly turned around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. And there, standing in the far corner of the basement, was a figure, a shadowy, translucent form. Her body glowing faintly but twisted, contorted. Her face was unrecognizable at first, a mask of anguish and rage. Then, slowly, the spirit turned toward Maya, her face coming into view. It was Eleanor. Her eyes were hollow, sunken in, and her skin was pale and decayed. But there was still life in those eyes, a deep, painful awareness. Eleanor raised a hand, pointing toward Maya. You are the one who can set me free." Maya stood frozen, paralyzed with fear, unable to speak. The ghost began to move toward her, her form flickering like a weak flame. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "I was tormented," Eleanor's voice echoed in the basement, "every night. They would torment me, tear me down, call me names. I tried to fight, but no one would listen. The walls, they trapped me. They suffocated me, and now I am trapped here forever. Help me, Maya. Help me uncover the truth. I cannot rest until I get justice." Maya's breath came out in sharp gasps, and her heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced. She had to act fast. Eleanor's spirit was desperate, reaching out with an energy that Maya could almost feel pulling at her. "I will expose them," Maya said, her voice shaky but determined. "I will tell everyone what happened to you. I'll make sure they know the truth." The ghost let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. The walls groaned. the lights flickering violently as if the very building was alive with rage. Maya's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled backward, almost tripping over a pile of old crates. But just as quickly as the chaos began, it stopped. The cold air lifted. The whispering ceased. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. Then Eleanor's spirit smiled. It was a smile twisted with pain, but there was relief in her expression. "You will set me free," she whispered. "You will expose them. If you don't, if you turn away now, you will be next." The spirit began to fade, her form dissolving into the air like mist. Maya stood motionless, her heart racing as she watched the ghost slowly vanish into nothingness. She felt the pressure in her chest lift as the last trace of Eleanor's presence evaporated. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway outside. Maya could hardly believe what had just happened, but she wasn't scared anymore. There was a sense of resolve within her. She knew what she had to do. She would uncover the truth. She would expose the horrors that had taken place in the dorm. The next few days were a blur of research, phone calls, and meetings. Maya combed through old documents, spoke with former students who had lived in the dorm, and even uncovered pictures that showed the stark contrast between what the administration claimed and what had really happened. The university had tried to bury the truth, but Maya's determination, driven by the spirit of Eleanor, was unstoppable. She presented the evidence to the student council, the media, and anyone who would listen. The stories of racial harassment, torment, and ultimately Eleanor's tragic death came to light. Maya's expose made waves, and the campus was rocked by the revelations. Soon after, the university had no choice but to close down the haunted dorm. The building was condemned, and the students were relocated. But the damage had already been done. The dark history of the dorm would live on, etched in the minds of everyone who heard the story. As Maya packed her things, preparing to leave the campus for good, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The whispers, although faint, were still there, lingering at the back of her mind. She turned to take one last look at the dorm building from her dorm room window. The moonlight reflected off the broken windows, casting eerie shadows across the abandoned structure. She sighed, a sense of closure washing over her. Then, as she was walking away, she heard it. "Maya." It was a soft whisper, but the words were clear. "Thank you." Maya froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. The campus was empty, the night silent except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. She smiled to herself, feeling the weight of the past few days lift. The spirit of Eleanor was finally at peace. But as she glanced at her reflection in the window, she caught something that made her blood run cold. Her own reflection wasn't smiling. It was grinning, but it was twisted, a cruel smirk that didn't match the relief she felt inside. Her eyes were filled with a dark hunger, an emptiness that hadn't been there before. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Had she truly helped Eleanor? Or had she become a part of something darker? Had she crossed a line she couldn't come back from? As she hurried out of the room and headed for the campus exit, she could still hear the faint whisper lingering in the air. "Thank you, Maya." But this time, it didn't sound like a grateful whisper. It sounded like a promise that would haunt her for the rest of her life. And as she left campus, she knew the whispers would never stop. Story 2. The Sorority's Secret. What if joining the most prestigious sorority meant stepping into a house full of secrets and dark rituals? For Jasmine, the initiation was just the beginning. Jasmine's pulse raced as she stepped into the grand sorority house, its majestic columns towering above her, the soft glow of chandeliers illuminating the darkened hallway. She had dreamed of this moment for months, if not years. This was her ticket to a future full of opportunity. But as she walked deeper into the mansion, she could feel it. There was something off, something hidden. The air felt thick, like the house itself was watching her. When the door slammed behind her, Jasmine realized she had just walked into a nightmare. Jasmine had always dreamed of joining the Kappa Theta sorority. Coming from a small town, she saw this as her big break. Her chance to rub elbows with the elite, get in the right social circles, and boost her career prospects. After all, the Kappa Theta sorority was known for its prestigious members, powerful alumni, and glamorous reputation. No one could deny the power of their network. But Jasmine, a black student, had always felt like an outsider in the world of privilege that the sorority represented. She was used to the subtle glances, the microaggressions, the feeling that she didn't quite belong. Joining Kappa Theta was supposed to be her way of proving she was just as good as anyone else. When she received the invitation to join, her heart raced. It was a golden ticket to a better life. She couldn't turn it down, but nothing had prepared her for what awaited inside those hallowed walls. The sorority house itself was massive, a 3-story mansion with ivy creeping up the sides and windows that seemed to watch you from every angle. There was something unsettling about the place. The old Victorian architecture, the heavy curtains that blocked out the sun, the way the house always seemed to be either too cold or too warm. It gave off a sense of timelessness, as if it had seen generations come and go, each leaving behind something darker than the last. On her first night, Jasmine was escorted into the house by the sisters, who had all perfected the art of looking down their noses at her with polite smiles. They showed her to her room on the second floor, a small, modest space with a single bed and a worn-out rug. But there was something in the air, something that sent a shiver down her spine. The walls seemed to whisper, though the house was silent. Jasmine couldn't put her finger on it, but she had a strange feeling that the house was alive in some way. The first night was when Jasmine started to notice the little things. During her initiation ceremony, she was told to perform a series of seemingly innocent tasks, like blindfolding herself and being led down dark hallways. At first, she thought it was just part of the tradition, an age-old ritual that would bring her closer to the sorority's sisterhood. But as the night wore on, the pranks became more uncomfortable, more humiliating. Her blindfold was removed in a dark room where she found herself standing in front of a mirror, her reflection distorted, as though something was wrong with the glass. The sisters laughed softly behind her, their voices dripping with mockery. "You think you belong here, Jasmine," one of them asked with a cold smile. But Jasmine didn't have time to react. They quickly moved her to another part of the house, chanting in low voices as they placed her in front of a grand fireplace, its flames casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Jasmine's stomach churned. Something didn't feel right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being tested in ways she didn't fully understand. The night dragged on, the initiation ceremony growing weirder with each passing minute. Jasmine's nerves were on edge, but she held it together. She had to. This was what she'd worked for. This was her future. But as she was led back to her room after the ceremony, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house had a strange quality, as though the walls were whispering secrets to each other. As she passed through the dark, long hallway that led to her room, she couldn't help but notice a door she hadn't seen before. It was set in a corner, hidden behind a curtain, almost as though it was trying to stay out of sight. The door was locked, and Jasmine couldn't help but feel drawn to it. She glanced around, but no one was there. The other girls had already gone back to their rooms, leaving her alone in the hallway. With a deep breath, she approached the door. Her fingers hovered over the cold metal handle. Should she open it? Her curiosity gnawed at her, but something held her back. The feeling that she shouldn't disturb whatever lay behind that door, that it wasn't meant for her, stopped her cold. With a quick glance over her shoulder, she turned and headed to her room. It wasn't long after that she began hearing the first strange noises. At night, when the house was still and the other girls were fast asleep, Jasmine would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling. Then, she'd hear it, soft chanting, distant but unmistakable. The words were too muffled to understand, but the cadence of the voices was unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of a prayer or a song, but something darker, something more ritualistic. Jasmine tossed and turned, trying to ignore it, but it continued every night, growing louder and more insistent. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, like the walls of the house were closing in around her. The chanting seemed to come from the floorboards beneath her bed, from the walls themselves. One night, after she could no longer bear the sound, Jasmine decided to investigate. She threw on a robe, grabbed her flashlight, and crept out of her room, careful not to disturb the others. The hallway was dark and silent, save for the soft click of her slippers on the wooden floor. She made her way to the room she had noticed earlier, the one with the locked door. To her surprise, the door was slightly ajar now. Jasmine hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. The chanting was louder, more distinct now. She could feel it vibrating in her bones. She pushed the door open, stepping into the dark room. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and in the dim light, she could make out symbols etched into the walls, strange, twisted shapes that seemed to move when she looked at them too long. The floor was covered in candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. And in the center of the room, standing in a circle, were the sorority sisters, their faces hidden by veils. Jasmine's stomach lurched. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew it wasn't good. "Jasmine," one of the sisters whispered, her voice low and eerie. "You shouldn't have come." Jasmine turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the dark room. The chanting grew louder, and Jasmine's heart raced. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to know. But now, there was no turning back. Jasmine's curiosity got the best of her. The locked door, the chanting, the unsettling atmosphere. It all gnawed at her, urging her to discover what lay beyond the veils of secrecy the sorority sisters had so carefully crafted. That night, while the rest of the house slept, she returned to the mysterious room. She had no idea what she would find, but something deep inside her urged her to press on. As she crept through the dark hallway, her flashlight flickering with each step, she found the door once again slightly ajar, just as it had been before. But this time, something felt different. A strange energy hung in the air, thick and oppressive. With a deep breath, Jasmine pushed the door open, her hand trembling slightly. The room was exactly as it had been before, dimly lit by candles that burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. But now, something had changed. The strange symbols etched into the walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the air smelled strongly of burnt herbs and incense. At the far end of the room, a large wooden chest sat on the floor, its edges worn and chipped. Jasmine's heart raced as she approached the chest, her pulse thundering in her ears. She could hear the chanting again, now muffled but insistent. Without thinking, she knelt beside the chest and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, there were relics, ornate necklaces, rings, and strange carved idols. But what caught her attention were the leather-bound diaries stacked neatly at the bottom of the chest. She grabbed one of the diaries, its pages yellowed with age. As she flipped through it, she began to read about the sorority's dark past, their use of rituals to maintain their power and influence over the school, and the lengths they would go to ensure their members stayed loyal. The diaries spoke of blood sacrifices, unholy pacts with shadowy figures, and the terrifying truth that no one who joined the sorority could ever leave, at least not without a price. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Spinning around, she saw a group of the sorority sisters standing in the doorway, their faces expressionless, their eyes cold and empty. "You shouldn't have come here, Jasmine," one of them said, her voice soft but firm. The others closed in, their faces now shadowed by the dim light. "You've seen too much." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She tried to back away, but one of the sisters stepped forward, blocking her path. "You don't understand," the sister continued, her voice low. "We are not just a sorority. We are a covenant, and there are consequences for digging into things that you shouldn't." Another sister stepped forward, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "You think you can just waltz in and expose our secrets? You think you're better than us." Jasmine stood frozen in fear, but something inside her snapped. She had uncovered too much. The power these women had was not ordinary. She needed answers, and there was no turning back. "You will regret this, Jasmine," one of the sisters hissed. "If you keep digging, you'll be forced to pay the price, just like everyone else." With that, the sisters turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jasmine alone with the relics and diaries. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no turning back now. She had to know everything. There was power here, and she wasn't going to walk away empty-handed. Jasmine's obsession with the rituals only grew after that night. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had learned, the power, the influence, the price of maintaining it. The sorority's leader, Clara, had warned her to stop digging, but Jasmine didn't listen. Instead, she began to pore over the diaries, studying the rituals in secret, convinced that if she performed one of them, she could gain the power she so desperately craved. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Jasmine gathered the necessary ingredients: candles, herbs, and the sacred necklace she had found in the chest. She retreated to the locked room, her mind racing with thoughts of what she could accomplish. She was no longer afraid. The power was within her reach, and all she had to do was summon it. Jasmine followed the instructions carefully, lighting the candles and drawing the symbols in the air with her fingers as instructed in the diaries. She chanted the words aloud, her voice trembling with excitement. The room seemed to come alive as the air grew heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. The floor beneath her feet seemed to vibrate as if the house itself was responding to her call. But then, something went terribly wrong. As Jasmine uttered the final words of the ritual, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in an instant. The shadows on the walls grew darker, shifting and twisting as if they had a mind of their own. She felt a presence in the room, something malevolent, something far darker than she had anticipated. The ground beneath her shook, and she stumbled backward, falling to the floor as a voice whispered in her ear, "You should have left it alone." Suddenly, the door burst open, and the sorority sisters rushed in, their eyes wide with terror. They tried to shout at Jasmine to stop, but it was too late. The ritual had been completed, and now something had been unleashed, something ancient, something unforgiving. The sisters began to scream, their bodies twisting and contorting as they were pulled into the shadows. One by one, they vanished, disappearing into thin air. Jasmine could only watch in horror as the members of the sorority, the women she had once admired, were consumed by the darkness they had awakened. In the aftermath, Jasmine was left standing in the center of the room, gasping for air, her heart still racing. The sorority sisters were gone, vanished without a trace. The house was eerily silent, the air still heavy with the dark energy that had been unleashed. Jasmine didn't know what to do. She had performed a ritual, but she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected them to disappear, hadn't expected the darkness to consume them all. The next morning, the house was strangely calm. It was as if nothing had happened at all. The other students on campus seemed to go about their day as if everything were normal, but Jasmine knew better. The sorority was no more. The women she had tried so desperately to be a part of were gone. But Jasmine's journey was far from over. The next night, she found herself in front of Clara, the sorority's former leader. Clara was standing in the middle of the room, a dark smile on her lips. "You've done well, Jasmine," she said, her voice cold. "But you've now taken on the burden we once carried." Jasmine's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Clara's smile widened. "You've become the new keeper of the house's secrets. The rituals are yours now. The power is yours. You'll never leave this place, and neither will anyone else." Jasmine's eyes widened as Clara's figure faded into the shadows. As the last of the sorority sisters disappeared, Jasmine understood the truth. She had been chosen to carry on the legacy of the house. As the days passed, Jasmine's demeanor began to change. She welcomed new pledges into the sorority, her eyes glowing unnaturally, her smile wide and cold. The cycle had begun again, and so, The dark secrets of the sorority lived on, passed down to the next unsuspecting pledge. Jasmine was now its keeper, and there was no escape. Story 3. The Art of Revenge. Kendra's paintings were her escape from reality. But when her art started coming to life, her bullies wished they'd never crossed her. Kendra sat alone in her small, cluttered art studio, the smell of oil paints and turpentine hanging thick in the air. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound, aside from the occasional brushstroke on canvas. For Kendra, the world around her didn't matter. Art was her escape, her refuge from the world that constantly made her feel like an outsider. At 22, Kendra had been studying art at the prestigious Harrison Institute of Art, a university known for its cutting-edge programs and competitive environment. But to Kendra, it was a place full of subtle, uncomfortable tension. She was one of the few black students in the entire art department, and despite her talent, she often felt invisible, except when she became the target of whispered comments or subtle racist jabs from her classmates. It wasn't that Kendra couldn't hold her own in the fiercely competitive art scene. In fact, her talent was undeniable. Her work had a raw intensity to it, a powerful emotion that many of her professors admired. But there was something about her presence, her quiet, reserved nature, that made the more popular students uneasy. And in a place where validation came from status and popularity, Kendra had neither. Her classmates would act polite, but the subtle digs, the sideways glances, and the dismissive comments were ever present. She'd learned to block it out, focusing on her art, but deep down, the hurt remained. One day, things went from bad to worse. A group of students, led by Allison, a girl with a sharp tongue and even sharper gaze, decided Kendra was an easy target. They started with small pranks, stealing her sketchbooks, defacing her work when she wasn't looking, and making snide remarks about her art. But it was when they mocked her work in front of the entire class that something inside Kendra snapped. She had poured her soul into every piece, and the thought of them mocking it was unbearable. It wasn't that Kendra was afraid of standing up for herself. She had done that countless times, but the group of students had a way of making her feel small, insignificant. They wielded their privilege like a weapon, knowing she couldn't fight back without consequences. That night, as the weight of the day's events sat heavily on her chest, Kendra did what she always did when life felt unbearable. She painted. Her brush danced across the canvas, creating dark, surreal imagery. She painted her tormentors, Allison, Brad, Emily, and the rest of the clique, in disturbing, almost otherworldly settings. Each portrait was an expression of her anger, her frustration, and her sense of helplessness. Allison was trapped in a cage, her face twisted in fear. Brad was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, paralyzed by his own fear of falling. Emily was surrounded by mirrors, each one showing a different reflection of her, a haunting array of distorted, nightmarish versions of herself. Kendra worked into the early hours of the morning, her movements feverish. Each brushstroke was a release, an attempt to manifest the rage and hurt she had bottled up. When she finally stepped back and looked at the finished pieces, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It was as though the act of painting had given her a sense of control over the chaos that had become her reality. The next day, when Kendra arrived at school, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her gut. It was as if the air itself was charged with tension. But she shrugged it off and went about her day, her focus on her art. As she walked into the studio, she saw a crowd gathered around the workstations, whispering among themselves. Kendra felt a tightening in her chest as she approached, her eyes darting nervously to the group. And then she saw it, her painting, the one she had just finished the night before, of Allison locked in a cage, her expression one of pure terror, was now the center of attention. It was hanging on the main wall of the studio, framed neatly, as though it had been put on display for all to see. Kendra's heart sank as she realized what had happened. Someone had taken her painting, without her permission, and put it up for the entire class to see. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The painting, her painting, was no longer just a piece of art. It felt different. The colors were richer, the shadows darker. The image of Allison in the cage looked even more real, more alive, as though the girl was truly trapped behind those bars. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. As Kendra stood there, her breath shallow, she heard a shrill scream. It echoed through the studio, sharp and high-pitched, causing everyone to turn in shock. Allison, she was standing by the window, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What the hell is going on?" she cried, her voice a mix of fear and disbelief. Everyone turned to look at her. Her face was a mirror of the expression in Kendra's painting. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open in a scream of pure terror, just like the girl in the cage. I saw something," Allison stammered. "Something was in the window. Something, it was like I couldn't move, like I was stuck." Kendra's mind raced. Had the painting somehow come to life? Was it some twisted coincidence that the exact scene from her canvas had manifested itself before her eyes? She couldn't explain it. She couldn't understand it. But something inside her was beginning to realize that her paintings had taken on a life of their own. Over the next few days, the oddities continued. The students who had tormented Kendra started to experience strange accidents. Brad, the arrogant jock, fell down a flight of stairs, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Emily, the quiet, insecure girl, was found in the locker room, standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection with wide, frightened eyes. Her reflection, however, wasn't the same. There was something wrong with it, something twisted and malevolent. Each incident mirrored something from Kendra's paintings, something she had created in her mind, but now it was real. It wasn't just coincidence. Her art was coming to life, and the ones who had tormented her were paying the price. The more Kendra painted, the more control she seemed to have over the chaos she had unleashed. But with that control came a terrifying realization. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the one in power. Her tormentors weren't just experiencing accidents. They were suffering, paying for their cruelty with fear and pain. But was this revenge enough? Or was something darker lurking beneath the surface of her creations? As the days passed, the incidents became even more unsettling. Kendra couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer just painting pictures. Something far more sinister had taken hold of her art. She had created this dark world on her canvas, but now it seemed like it was bleeding into reality. One evening, after class, Kendra walked into her studio and immediately felt a chill in the air. Her paintings were still there, hanging on the walls, their eerie scenes of torment and dread staring back at her. But something was different. The colors were deeper, the shadows darker, as though the paintings had grown stronger, more alive. Her eyes landed on the canvas she had painted of Allison, locked in the cage. But this time, the image wasn't static. Allison's painted face seemed to shift, her eyes flickering with an unnatural light. It was as though the girl in the painting could see Kendra, could feel her presence. Kendra hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. She reached out, her fingers trembling, as she touched the painted bars of the cage. The moment her hand made contact, a sharp, piercing scream filled the room, echoing in her ears. Kendra jerked her hand back, but the sound wouldn't stop. It was coming from the painting, from the girl trapped inside. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, quick and frantic. She spun around to see Emily standing in the doorway, her face pale and filled with fear. "Kendra, you've got to stop," Emily said, her voice shaking. This is getting out of control. People are getting hurt." Kendra's eyes narrowed. Emily had been one of the students who had mocked her, who had tormented her in subtle ways, just like the others. But now, here she was, pleading for Kendra to stop. "Why, so you can all get away with it." Kendra spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think I don't know what you've been doing? You think I haven't seen how you all laughed when you thought you were getting under my skin?" Emily flinched, and for a moment, Kendra almost felt sorry for her, but that feeling quickly vanished. "You think I'm the one causing all this? Look around you. The paintings, they're real. They've come to life, Emily. They're doing what I couldn't. But as Kendra said the words, she felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was something far darker. Her paintings were no longer just reflections of her pain. They were manifestations of something far more ancient. I don't know how much longer I can control this, Kendra whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't even know if I can stop it, but Emily wasn't listening. She turned on her heel and fled the room, leaving Kendra standing alone in the eerie silence. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences grew worse. Brad, who had fallen down the stairs, began to suffer from nightmares so vivid and terrifying that he couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, screaming, "Get out of the cage! Get me out of here!" But no one knew what he was talking about. And Emily, poor, frightened Emily, disappeared without a trace. The only clue was a strange, cryptic message scratched into the mirror in the art studio. "You can never escape your reflection." It was a phrase Kendra had written in one of her sketches, but it had never been meant to be more than just an expression of her inner turmoil. But now it was a warning. Kendra could feel the darkness that had settled over her art like a suffocating blanket. The walls of her studio seemed to close in around her, and every painting felt like a curse, a tether to something far beyond her understanding. Her hands, once steady with the brush, now trembled with the weight of what she had unleashed. The more she painted, the more the reality of her power and the consequences became clear. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. The paintings were alive, and they were feeding off her anger, her fear, her every dark emotion. And it was only a matter of time before they turned on her, too. Kendra's worst fear was realized when, one evening, she stepped into her studio and saw something that stopped her heart dead in her chest. In the center of the room, the painting of Allison, the one where she was trapped in a cage, had changed. The bars of the cage were now glowing with an eerie light, casting long shadows across the floor. And inside the cage, Allison's face was no longer just fearful. It was contorted, twisted, her eyes bulging with an inhuman intensity. But the most terrifying part, Allison's mouth was open, as if screaming for help. And then it happened. A cold wind rushed through the room, extinguishing the lights and plunging Kendra into darkness. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and Kendra's breath caught in her throat. She could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming toward her, echoing in the silence of the room. She spun around, her heart racing, but saw nothing. That's when she heard it. A voice, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." Kendra froze, her blood running cold. She turned back to the painting, and there in the dim light, she saw it. Allison, her eyes now open wide, staring directly at Kendra. The girl in the cage was moving, her body jerking in unnatural motions as though she were alive, reaching out to Kendra through the canvas. Before Kendra could react, the door to the studio slammed open, and in rushed a familiar figure, Brad. But he wasn't the same. His eyes were wide with terror, and his hands shook uncontrollably as he pointed at the painting. "No, you've got to stop. You've unleashed something," Brad screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "We're all going to die." Kendra felt a sickening twist in her stomach. It wasn't just Allison now. All of her tormentors, all the people she had painted in these horrifying scenes, were coming to life. They were trapped in her art, but now they were aware of the torment they had suffered at her hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Kendra whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted them to understand, but it was too late." The air in the room thickened with dark energy, and Kendra could feel the paintings closing in on her. They were no longer her creations. They were her prison. The sorority students, the victims of Kendra's vengeful art, were now a permanent part of her life. As the last of the students vanished, one by one, their fates sealed in the very pieces of art she had created, Kendra could feel the weight of what she had done. She was alone in the studio, standing before the canvas that had once been her escape, but now was the source of her torment. The painting of Allison, of Emily, of Brad. They all stared back at her with accusing eyes. "I can't undo it," Kendra whispered, her voice hoarse. But as she turned to leave the studio, she felt a chill pass over her, the unmistakable presence of something otherworldly. She glanced back, half expecting to see the paintings shift, to hear the voices of her tormentors calling out for revenge. Instead, she saw something far worse, her own reflection in the glass. But it wasn't the Kendra she knew. The woman staring back at her had eyes that glowed with a dark, unnatural light. A twisted smile curled on her lips. "You're just like them now," the reflection whispered. "You've become the monster you always feared." And as Kendra turned to leave, she heard the faintest whisper of her name, echoing in the darkness. "Kendra, join us." The door to the studio slammed shut behind her, and the world went silent. But the paintings, the horrors Kendra had created, remained, and the once quiet artist had become the keeper of their darkest secrets. Drop a comment below and share your experiences. If you enjoyed these creepy college tales and want to hear more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. There's always more mystery waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. So, until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember to always trust your instincts. Comment below and let's keep the conversation going. We'll be reading every one of your comments and sharing more of these spine-tingling stories soon.